What is more destructive than Ebola or international terrorism? As the numbers show, it's corruption. In 2004, the World Bank put the total yearly amount of bribes paid globally at $1 trillion, about 3% of the world's GDP at the time. Corruption hinders economic development and innovation, thus making it a target for international organizations and politicians worldwide. But can corruption sometimes be helpful? Not hamper development, but rather spur it on? This is to be debated. Corruption is not only about bribes, it's more broadly understood as a misuse of entrusted authority for personal benefit. Of course, one can misuse authority in various different ways, like being absent from work or watching cat videos all day while still being paid a wage at taxpayers' expenses. But a lazy official would not be considered corrupt. Unlike those who engage in theft or embezzlement of public resources, which is another type of corruption. For instance, the former Indonesian dictator Suharto, in 31 years in office, has embezzled from $15 to $35 billion. Whereas General Abacha and President Mobutu and Marcos misappropriated around $5 billion each. Political patronage is also corruption, based on rent-seeking behaviour of cronies. Say some presidents have a bunch of friends who are pitching ideas that are very beneficial for them, but not so for much of the country, and he doesn't mind. And these lost opportunities are the most complicated and least calculated and recorded aspects of global corruption. The negative outcomes of corruption are obvious. Though to start with, it undermines fair competition, leading to a rise in prices across the board. In the end, we end up paying more for food and for entertainment, even though the president's friends have no interest in entertainment at all. Secondly, corruption gives birth to economic uncertainty and unpredictability, which stifles entrepreneurial activity as well as hindering innovation and investment, which again sends prices soaring. The incentive system in society is then distorted. Young, educated people see how it works and start seeking for a plum job instead of taking up some productive activity. What comes next is low trust in public institutions, growth inequality and crime, and at worst, the delegitimization of state, political and social turmoil. To assess these risks, people try to measure corruption, as is being done by Transparency International, for example. These figures are then compared with economic indicators, a process called cross-country regression analysis. Here, every country is just a dot on a scatter plot. And there one can see a per unit increase in corruption perception index inevitably leads to a 1% decline in economic growth rate. This really is quite a lot. For India, say, 1% is about $70 million per year. And to be able to reduce corruption down to a level of Hungary, should have to pump up her GDP per capita by 157%. For the past 10 years, India has been growing at a 6% growth rate. So economic transparency is still something far in the future. But then we have South Korea. Corruption is pretty high here, but there's still no problem with economic growth, just like in China, India, and Indonesia. These nations are far from being economic dwarfs, and so this cannot be accounted for as a measurement error. Researchers call it the Asian paradox, a centuries-old tradition of collusive relationships between businesses and political power fits easily with tremendous economic growth. So, can corruption actually be a good thing and even contribute to economic development? But how? Oriental magic? Not really. As we found, corruption is all about circumventing the law, either by means of direct violation or by finding loopholes. Corruption can therefore be either good or bad, depending on whether the initial law is good or bad. Researchers claim that corruption can work as a trouble-saving device in over-regulated economies. In other words, there's too many rules and official procedures take months to follow. Getting around them can save resources, encourage more business activity, and boost economic growth. For example, it was only in 1997 that Chinese banks were allowed to provide loans to private entrepreneurs. But even beforehand, public officials had the power to intervene in credit decisions of local branches of state-owned banks, and to issue licenses for construction on state-owned land too, all in return for fair compensation, naturally. Thanks to these informal financial relations, namely corruption, that famous Chinese economic wonder evolved. Besides, one should remember that fighting corruption is not costless, and the price for its total eradication could be too high even for developed economies. For instance, as estimated by BNP Paribas, the anti-corruption campaign Xi Jinping's government has been running over the past 2 years has knocked 1 to 1.5% of China's GDP each year. The reason for this is that public officials have taken fright and now refrain from signing off on new projects. To sum up, matters are not so clear-cut. The relationship between corruption levels and economic development is not so linear. According to latest research, it looks like this. The most corrupt are the middle-income economies and not the poorest, where there are not so many resources to fight over. At first, growth of corruption levels follows economic growth. But after reaching a certain income level, economies start getting more transparent. So, if you live in Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kenya, Tanzania, or Bangladesh, corruption is relatively harmless, and battling it could potentially do more harm than good. At this stage of development, it's better to focus on building up public institutions. But in high-income countries, it can have a very destructive effect. Nations that have an extremely high corruption level for their economic development ranking include Russia, Slovakia, Italy, Malta, Greece, Taiwan, South Korea, the Czech Republic, Cyprus, Syria, Venezuela, and many more. On the contrary, positive examples include Botswana, Bhutan, Costa Rica, Rwanda, and Jordan. Whilst not being the richest, they still manage to keep corruption close to the levels of many Eastern European countries. In this way, whether corruption is bad or beneficial depends heavily on other factors: the rule of law, democracy and education levels, social inequality, and so on. Besides, it's not clear as to whether some countries are so clean by their own doing due to laws or mentality, or if this is because they export corruption elsewhere. Take, for example, Sweden. She's number 3 in the world's transparency ranking, and yet her largest and partly state-owned mobile operator, TeliSonera, is facing allegations of paying $320 million in bribes to the family of Islam Karimov, the former president of Uzbekistan. To wrap up our debate, here's Li Xiaozhong. Over 8 years in office, the former Chinese Minister of Railways not only accumulated $250 million in bribes, earning himself a life sentence, but also managed to construct the largest network of high-speed railways in the world, 20,000 kilometres, or 60% of all such railways in the world. Would he have constructed even more had he not been corrupt? Or vice versa, might he not even have embarked on it, given the lack of such an incentive? What's next to be debated? Subscribe to the channel and never miss our new videos. And you can support us on Patreon. It's so much appreciated.